Hello everyone, I'm Sonia Savage, Minister of Energy for the province of Alberta. I'm joined today by my good friend, James Rajat, who is Alberta's Senior Representative to the United States. James is based in Alberta's Washington office.
Happy to be here, Minister. Wonderful to be with you. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to participate in the Utah Economic and Energy Summit. We've seen many conferences go virtual this year, so congratulations to the Summit's team for finding a way to blend in-person and virtual content for participants.
Well, James, I think we've all been through a lot of virtual meetings this year, more than we ever thought possible. And speaking of meetings, James, as our senior representative in Washington, you've been meeting with hundreds of policymakers, both at the national and state levels. Perhaps you could tell folks here a little bit about yourself, your background, the kind of work you've been doing, and what you've been focused on since taking your role earlier this year.
Certainly, Minister, I'm happy to speak about that. My past experience was spending 15 years in our national parliament. I was a member of parliament from Edmonton, Alberta for 15 years. I chaired our House of Commons Finance Committee for a 7-year period from 2008 to 2015 during some very challenging economic times. I also chaired our Industry, Science and Technology Committee for 2 years and gained a lot of experience there. And I was part of the Canada-US Interparliamentary Group for over a decade and had just some wonderful exchanges and contacts with U.S. policymakers south of the border during that time.
Well, thanks, James. We definitely could not have a more qualified person filling this role, and I'm glad you're there. I'm glad you're taking it on, and I'm glad to call you my friend. The work that you and the Washington office have been doing is really, really very important in strengthening the relationship between Alberta and the U.S. This is particularly true when it comes to North American energy security and discussing how we can deal collaboratively with the threats to both our markets. These are topics I also discuss with my counterparts at the state level. I've had the opportunity to speak with many of them during meetings of the Energy Council in particular. The Canadian and U.S. energy markets are highly integrated, which is demonstrated by Canada being the single largest foreign supplier of energy to the United States. And the combined strength of our markets is essential to North American energy security.
Absolutely, Sonia. And in fact, Canada has been by far the largest crude oil exporter to the United States. This makes us a dependable provider of feedstock for the U.S. fleet of heavy oil refineries.
And you know, James, this is more important than ever in today's investment climate. Providing our American neighbors with more Canadian crude oil means they can become less reliant on resources that come from other countries that don't share our same commitment to social and environmentally responsible energy development.
That's absolutely correct, Sonia. The continued collaboration between our jurisdictions is key to our collective future prosperity and stability. It goes without saying that the commodity price crisis and the economic impacts of the pandemic have severely impacted the North American energy industry. By continuing to work together as allies, we can secure a sufficient supply of North American oil. Cooperation will also provide North American consumers with access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy to fuel our everyday lives and support economic development.
That's certainly our goal, James. In fact, this was the driving factor behind the Alberta government's decision to invest in the Keystone XL pipeline. The project will increase our ability to meet demand. Upon completion, KXL will move up to 830,000 barrels of Alberta crude to the U.S. market. This is crude oil that is desperately needed in refineries in the U.S. Gulf Coast. As we already mentioned, once operational, Keystone XL will enable the U.S. to displace oil coming from other countries like Venezuela that don't share the same values that our great partnership demonstrates. And so we remain very confident that Keystone XL will be a critical part of North America's post-pandemic economic recovery.
And of course, Minister, the project is already under construction.
You bet, that's right. It has long held widespread bipartisan support from U.S. lawmakers, including all governors in the states that the pipeline travels through.
In fact, I believe the numbers indicate that the pipeline will support tens of thousands of U.S. jobs and create millions of dollars of tax revenue that will be used to build better communities for American and Canadian families.
Yes, the latest estimates show that the project's workforce and other employment created by supplying goods and services to that workforce will account for approximately 42,000 jobs in the U.S. and 17,000 more in Canada. Workers are already working on this shovel-ready project that puts citizens in both Canada and the U.S. back to work. In this past May, Keystone XL successfully completed the construction of the Canada-U.S. border crossing section of the pipeline. It's done. It's in the ground. Since then, construction has kicked off in Alberta, where a total of 269 kilometers of pipeline and 5 pump stations will be constructed over the next 2 years.
And Keystone XL is only one part of the major pipeline projects underway. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and the Enbridge Line 3 replacement projects are progressing. Upon completion, these 3 projects will help Alberta maintain a long-term balance between production and takeaway capacity.
A long-term balance, that's key, James, because every credible forecast of future oil world energy consumption sees oil and gas continuing to dominate the energy mix for decades to come. Earlier this fall, OPEC and the International Energy Agency both released their forecasts. And while both growth for both oil and gas is projected to level off sometime in the 2030s or 2040s, this strong demand will remain in the long term. And Alberta is well positioned to meet that demand. We're home to the 3rd largest reserves of oil in the world, which also represents 43% of the world's global reserves open to the private sector.
And it's not just oil and gas that Alberta has to offer to the world, though. There are a lot of exciting opportunities outside of the traditional bedrocks of Alberta energy.
Exactly, James. We have some incredible opportunities in new and emerging energy sources, as well as the sectors that are directly connected to the traditional oil and gas sectors. I mentioned earlier about the possibility of a plateau in oil and gas demand sometime in the 2030s or 2040s. But those same forecasts also show that the overall demand for energy will continue to grow. These sectors are going to fill the gap between a stabilizing demand for oil and gas and the growing demand for energy in general. I'm specifically thinking about energy sources like hydrogen and geothermal, as well as natural gas-derived products like petrochemicals, plastics, things we use every day.
In fact, Sonia, you recently launched a new strategy specifically targeting those new and emerging fields, the natural gas vision and strategy. Isn't that right?
That's right. And in each and every one of these exciting new sectors, we have many natural advantages here in Alberta that put us in a position to compete with jurisdictions around the world for investment.
And a lot of those advantages stem from the expertise and experience in the oil and gas sectors as well.
That's right again, James. In petrochemicals, for instance, we have huge reserves of natural gas as feedstock for companies, available at a low cost on account of the extremely competitive nature of our gas producers. And more so, we already have a well-established petrochemical industry here in Alberta, capable of supporting the midstream sectors and larger producers, as well as a skilled workforce here that's knowledgeable about the industry and the needs of various international markets.
In fact, Sonia, petrochemicals are already Alberta's largest manufacturing export. It is a tremendous success story that does not get nearly the attention it deserves, both here at home and in the United States. Alberta may not always show up on an investor's radar when considering where to locate their next big petrochemical facility, but there's a great opportunity here for international investors.
Well, we're hoping that it'll begin to show up on that radar, and we're hoping to change that, specifically with something we announced back in July called the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program. This program is essentially going to provide direct reimbursement for capital costs on big petrochemical investments.
And Minister, I understand it was a program actually inspired by similar ones in some American states. Places like Pennsylvania, Texas, and Louisiana also have incentive programs in place to draw investment to that particular sector. It's fantastic Alberta is offering a comparable set of incentives to meet the competition and help cement our position on the map of major petrochemical producers.
Well, James, we have a goal of becoming one of the top 10 global petrochemical producing regions in the world. And we firmly believe that we have all the elements in place to catch that global goal in the coming years.
In fact, Sonia, it's not the only sector where Alberta has global ambitions, though. Hydrogen has been getting a lot of attention lately, and Alberta has the potential to become a major supplier of clean hydrogen, not just domestically, but for the US and other international markets. Can you speak to the plans for hydrogen?
Well, it's definitely a major opportunity for Alberta. And once again, we owe a lot of that opportunity to our established strengths. Alberta's biggest opportunity with hydrogen is what's called blue hydrogen, where natural gas is converted to hydrogen and the resulting carbon byproducts are diverted using carbon capture, storage, and utilization.
And Minister, obviously Alberta has a lot of experience with carbon capture, utilization, and storage as well.
You bet, James. We're actually one of the early pioneers of CCUS. And we have one project that has already safely sequestered over 5 million tons of carbon dioxide since 2015. And our geology is well suited to future expansions of this technology. That means that we have almost unlimited feedstock for the production of hydrogen and natural reserves to safely store the resulting carbon. And Alberta is already one of the largest hydrogen producers in the world. So this work is right in our area of expertise. We've already made commitments to further this sector, including a set of pilot projects. We're also looking at where we can make key strategic investments to advance the infrastructure and other components that will be necessary to develop a full hydrogen economy here in Alberta.
And Sonia, once that economy is in place, we will obviously be in an excellent position to meet global demand for a clean energy product. And speaking of clean energy, another source that Alberta is in a great position to leverage is in the area of geothermal energy.
You bet, James. We just tabled legislation, Bill 36 in our legislature yesterday to support this new and growing industry. And once again, it's a combination of natural geology as well as oil and gas expertise that puts us in a good position to take leadership in this new geothermal sector. One of the most promising pathways to access geothermal energy is using the existing well sites used from oil and gas to reach centers of energy. Alberta has a lot of these wells, and we have a very strong understanding of our geology. So we know that there is a whole bunch of potential geothermal energy waiting to be tapped underneath our soil.
Absolutely, Sonia. When I've been meeting with potential investors, it is a point I bring up often. Alberta's adaptability is actually our strongest suit, and Alberta companies and innovators are ready to take the lead in new fields like geothermal.
That's a great point, James. Alberta's adaptability. It's allowed us to apply our expertise across these sectors. I would also add that Alberta's commitment to responsible energy development is also one of our strengths here in Alberta. Our energy is produced under the world's highest environmental, human rights, and labor standards.
In fact, Minister, I believe that Canada, led by Alberta, ranks third in global ESG factors among oil-producing countries.
It does, according to an aggregate of rankings. That's taking into account Alberta's long tradition of taking action on climate issues. In fact, more than 2 decades of climate-related programs and policy that paved the way for other jurisdictions.
Minister, it's important to highlight that Alberta was the first jurisdiction to place a price on carbon for all large emitters across all sectors.
Absolutely, James. And since then, we've invested billions of dollars into technologies that reduce or even eliminate emissions. A barrel of Canadian oil is getting better all the time, each and every day.
In fact, Sonia, the numbers are remarkable. Since 2011, per barrel GHG emissions have decreased by 20%. And that number is expected to decrease further by another 20% over the next decade.
That's right, James. Our producers in Alberta have truly been trailblazers in the industry. But we recognize that there's more to be done. Both the government and industry have shown leadership on responsible energy development. Several major oil sands companies, like Canadian Natural Resources and Cenovus, have set net zero emission goals.
And in fact, Sonia, Alberta is also doing some exciting work with its technology innovation and emissions reduction system.
Yes, James, it's called the TIER program. The system is Alberta's approach to reducing emissions from large industrial emitters and keeping that same industry competitive. The tier system is funded by large industry, which pay into the fund when they don't meet their emission targets. This support will help industry reduce emissions and will also assist Alberta's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and low oil prices. It will be more than doubled by additional dollars from industry and other sectors, leading to more than $1.9 billion in total funding.
In fact, Sonia, this funding will be incredibly important as it will support projects like new and improved oil sands extraction technology and research and investment into carbon capture and storage, which, as we've mentioned before, is integral to developing a hydrogen economy.
Exactly.
I think it's important to share the good work being done here in Alberta, and just as importantly, help others understand that this kind of progress is possible only because of how we encourage innovation and entrepreneurship.
I agree. Alberta is the most business-friendly jurisdiction. We're competitive and we're open for business.
That's certainly true, Sonia. In fact, Alberta has a competitive tax structure and the lowest corporate tax rate in Canada. Alberta has no retail sales tax, no payroll tax, and low personal income tax. Combine the low taxes with a province-wide initiative to reduce red tape, and I believe that most would agree that Alberta is a fantastic place to do business. And that's before we mention that Alberta has the most educated workforce and the highest labor productivity in the country.
It's also a fantastic place to live. Alberta's cities frequently rank as one of the best places in the world to live in international rankings. We've got affordable housing, low-cost utilities, quality education, and healthcare systems.
And don't forget spectacular natural landscapes from the prairies to our wonderful Rocky Mountains.
Well, James, we couldn't ask for a better representative for Alberta in Washington. James, thank you for joining me here today.
My pleasure, Minister, and we could not ask for a better energy minister for Alberta. And thank you for the work that you do, and wonderful to be with you here today.
Well, thanks, everyone.